It's time for Recipe of the Day. If you've got yourself a whole head of cabbage, but you've never really worked with one before, it can be a bit daunting. It's kind of a large, gnarly, hard vegetable, right? So today I am explaining to you how to prepare a cabbage for a variety of different purposes. For doing stuffed cabbage, like cabbage rolls or holupchi, for doing coleslaw, so like fine shreds, and for doing like chunkier pieces for like a stir fry or soup. Okay, the most common types of cabbage that you'll see are the like normal standard green cabbage. It's a pale green color, round, hard cabbage, and the red cabbage. It's kind of a purplish color, and you're going to find those in most grocery stores year round. The other two common kinds are Savoy and Napa. You can use those any place that calls for the red cabbage or green cabbage. I don't tend to choose either of those for cabbage rolls or stuffed cabbage, but that's just because that wasn't my tradition. I actually haven't tried it, but I've heard that the Savoy cabbage works really well for cabbage rolls. So that is something I need to give a try at some point. Both the Savoy and the Napa tend to be a little more tender than the green and red cabbage. And so they're great for any raw preparations like coleslaw, but also really good in stir fries, soups, anything like that. And I'll just tell you, a standard cabbage, like a normal green cabbage, will usually serve 4 to 6 people depending on what you're using it for. You'll get 7 to 8 cups of shredded cabbage if you're going to slice it the way I'm going to explain, like for making coleslaw, from one head, which is the equivalent of a 16-ounce bag of shredded cabbage. So that's useful to know. If you buy the bag, then you're looking at about 7 to 8 cups. And if you have a cabbage, that's equivalent to a recipe that's calling for the bag. Okay, now if you want whole leaves of cabbage, like for doing the stuffed cabbage, you don't want to cut the head in half or in quarters before you start, because you'll be cutting through some of the leaves, which you want to remain whole. And what's usually going to happen is you're going to want to blanch the cabbage, which means putting it in boiling water. That's going to soften the leaves so that you can fold them to make the cabbage rolls. So we want whole, full leaves, and we're going to be boiling them. We boil them still attached to the cabbage, or I guess attached to each other, really. They're kind of like nested leaves, one on top of the other. So what you're going to do is you're just going to cut off the stem end of the cabbage, leaving the head intact. And then you're going to go in with your knife angled and just sort of cut out the core from the middle. So now you have a still intact head of cabbage that's just missing some of its center. Then that is what you're going to put in a big pot of boiling water. And you use a pair of tongs to just kind of turn it over every now and then. And the outer leaves of the cabbage are going to heat first. And as they do, they're going to sort of soften and become easier to dislodge from the head. And you're using a pair of tongs or 2 pairs to kind of pull those leaves off as they loosen from the head, and you just pull off a few and then test if they are pliable. I use the tongs still to just kind of bend the cabbage leaf in half. If it bends fairly easily, then I use the tongs to take it out of the boiling water, put it on a plate, and then you just keep pulling off those leaves as they heat. And then once they become pliable, you add them to your plate with the finished ones. And that is how you make the cabbage ready to stuff or use for cabbage rolls. You can also do this if you're using the cabbage for like some kind of garnish. Sometimes plates are lined with it because it's very inexpensive and stays green for a long time. So you can blanch the heads like this and then lay them on a platter and then put other things on top. Okay, now if you want cabbage for a stir fry or for a coleslaw, you want either thin shreds or more chunks. Either way, I find it best to cut the whole head of cabbage in half. So you're starting with a uncooked, cold, fresh head of cabbage, cut it all the way through in half. And now you can actually see the core exposed in the middle. You're just going to cut that out. Now, why I like to cut it in half first is after you take that core out, you then flip it cut side down. You have a nice flat surface. And then as you're cutting, it's not like moving all around or moving over. Some people quarter the heads of cabbage before they start slicing or chopping them, but then it's just a little bit more like easy for it to topple over. This gives you a much steadier surface. So you cut it in half and then you cut out the core and then you put it cut side down. And then if you're doing coleslaw or something that needs those fine shreds, sauerkraut would be another thing that needs the fine shreds, then you just go with your knife across the head, very, very close together, like at less than 1/8 of an inch thick, really. Now, if you want something chunkier for a stir fry or like a soup, and I have that ground beef and cabbage recipe coming soon to tell you about, then you just cut it as thicker sort of strips. And then both for the shredded for coleslaw and for when I want something chunkier, I usually run my knife through it in the other direction as well. So do all the slices all the way and then turn kind of perpendicular to those and run my knife through it. And it makes all the pieces a little bit more bite size and not like big long strands. I guess if I'm doing sauerkraut, I could leave them as long strands because it softens them so much that you can like wind them around your fork and they don't have to be bite sized in and of themselves. But for like coleslaw, it doesn't always soften those cabbage shreds fully. And then you have these like big long strands. You don't want those. The only other thing I'll say is I've been telling you to take the core out all along at each of these different types of preparations that I've been doing. And some people actually leave it in for some things, in particular for roasting. They'll cut the cabbage into wedges, sort of in half and then in quarter, and then maybe even into eighths. And they leave the core in there because it holds the leaves all together while it's roasting so they don't fall off. I don't love to do that because the core never does really fully soften and stays really hard in the middle. And like if I'm serving that to somebody, they might start trying to eat that hard part that's in the middle and it's not going to be as good. I don't mind the leaves falling off, but it is an option if that's something you're interested in. Okay, I will put the link to this cabbage tutorial in the show notes for this podcast episode, or you can head to cookthestory.com/ROTD and get it there. Everything there is arranged by date, so it's helpful to know that today is March 12th of 2025. We are doing this cabbage just in time for St. Patrick's Day next week. All that corned beef and cabbage goodness coming your way, right? It's a very tasty time of year. I'm Christine Pittman from cookthestory.com, thecookful.com, the all-new chicken cookbook, and from this podcast recipe of the day. I hope you have a great day. Let's get cooking.